Hi, my friends, welcome. If you're new around here, my name is Akila, and I am a 200-hour registered yoga teacher. Today, we're going to be doing a little bit of a chat, and I'm going to talk about what poses I don't teach and why I don't teach them. Some of these are not poses that I don't teach altogether, but they are poses that I very rarely teach, and I will give my reasoning as to why for all of them. So you'll notice a trend in a lot of these poses. We're going to be talking a lot about joint limitation today and why I feel so passionately about it and how it comes into play with each of these poses and why that leads me to not want to teach them. I want to give a disclaimer that just because I don't like to teach these poses doesn't mean that these poses don't have benefits or that other teachers that choose to teach them are not good teachers. These poses have a time and a place. I personally just have strong beliefs about what they require, and I just choose not to include them in the practices that I sequence personally. But this doesn't mean that if you like them, there's something wrong with your favorite pose or anything like that. It's just that these are the reasons why I don't personally enjoy teaching them. And I'm sure that lots of different teachers have opinions about other poses that maybe I love to sequence in, and they, for whatever reason, don't like to do those poses, or maybe there's transitions that I do that they don't agree with. So a lot of this is going to be preference and just my opinion, but I'm going to give a little bit of context in the anatomy as well as to why I personally don't prefer these poses and why I might sequence in something else that is going to achieve the same thing. So all that being said, let's get into it. The first pose that I generally don't sequence into my classes is Warrior One. So the first reason that I don't really sequence Warrior One is because Warrior One and I, we're not friends. We don't like each other, we don't get along. We have respect for each other, but we kind of stay out of each other's way. I just let her do her thing, and she kind of leaves me alone. And that's the way that we like it. So I'm not a big fan of Warrior One. I don't personally like the way that it feels in my body. And part of the reason why I don't like this particular pose is because it requires a lot of range of motion in the hip. So we're going to be coming into extension with the hip and then extreme flexion with the back foot. So usually, rather than sequencing in a Warrior One, I will sequence in a high crescent lunge instead. So the difference between the Warrior One and the high crescent lunge is that in Warrior One, the back foot is externally rotated slightly and the back heel is down, whereas in the crescent lunge, the back heel will be flipped up. You're on the ball of the back foot, and then it's a little bit more accessible to square the hips off to the front of the mat. So a lot of times you'll hear teachers sequence in a Warrior One that they want you to try your best to square your hips to the top of your mat. With the orientation of that back foot in external rotation, it is extremely hard to do that. And often what I see happen when people try to get the back heel down and the back leg in external rotation in their Warrior One, the front knee, which should be completely parallel and tracking over the front toes, is then starting to cave in a little bit as a result of that back hip peeling open. And it is very difficult to square that hip down and maintain that extreme flexion of the back foot and still keep the heel down on the ground. So let's talk a little bit about the ankle joint and why extreme flexion of the ankle is difficult for a lot of people. So you have a bone, and it's at the top of your foot where the top of your foot meets the base of your shin bones. So this bone is called the talus, and if you have a talus bone that is larger, it can make it really difficult for you to come into flexion of the ankle. So think about flexing your toes up towards your shin. So if you have this anatomical disposition of this larger talus bone, when you flex the foot, it can feel very intense, or it can even feel that it gets stuck or stiff at a certain point and you feel like you can't flex it anymore. So a way that you might be able to test this is you can come onto your shin, one shin, and then the other foot is going to step forward in front of the other shin, and you'll start to lean your weight forward and try and really take a lot of weight into your front foot and see how much flexion of the ankle you can get before you feel like you're at a stopping point. When you hit your stopping point, you may notice a lot of sensation in the back side of the calf and the Achilles tendon, or you may notice a stuckness sensation in the front of the ankle. If you're feeling it in the calf and the Achilles, that is something that you can work on stretching and improving the mobility there. But if you're feeling it stuck in the front of the ankle, it likely means that your talus bone is getting in the way. So when we're in our warrior one and that back foot has the heel down, we're coming into a really, really extreme flexion of the ankle, and it could be that your talus bone is getting in the way, and it could be very uncomfortable for you. So by flipping up the back heel, it can alleviate some of that tension. So that's why I prefer to teach a high crescent lunge than I do to teach a warrior one. The other thing about warrior one is we have external rotation of that back leg, which is coming from the hip, and the hip joint is going to be a similar situation. The way that your hip joint rests in your hip socket is going to be laid out a little bit differently for everyone. So some people have a more shallow hip socket and some people have a deeper hip socket. If you have a deeper hip socket, you may not have as much range of motion before your bones start to come into contact. So your femoral head, this is the top of your femur bone, imagine. That's your thigh bone. It's rounded at the top and then it kind of tapers and comes a little bit thinner. And that ball at the top of your bone rests in the hip socket and it can move like so. But you might get to a point where the edge of your hip socket is coming into contact with the bone and then you can't go anymore. So this comes into play with external rotation of the hip when you're trying to pull the knees out towards the side, or if you're trying to work towards a middle split, for example, you may notice that you're really struggling to get that range of motion. It could have something to do with a lack of flexibility, but it also could have something to do with your bone structure. And this was an injury that I had, which is partially why I feel so passionately about this. So you have a cartilage inside of your hip socket that protects your bones from coming into contact with one another. But occasionally, if you're pushing yourself past your boundaries, you may wear down that cartilage that is there to protect your bones, and that is what's called a labral tear. So if you wear down the cartilage enough, it becomes a labral tear, and then you may have what happened to me, which is the cartilage is then gone, and then your bones are coming into contact with one another. And eventually, if you're bashing your bones into one another, one of them's going to give. So you either are going to wind up with a fractured pelvis or a fractured femur, which is what happened to me. It's a very painful injury. I feel very passionately that we should always be really mindful with how we move our joints and how far we push them, and really be observant about where you feel sensations, and if you start to feel discomfort or pain, what does that pain feel like and where is it located? So you can really start to do some investigations for yourself about if you're potentially working against your own anatomy. So that was a lot of rambling about joints, but it is going to be relevant for the other poses that we're going to talk about as well. So it is a little bit of important groundwork to lay. So those are my reasons as to why I prefer not to sequence Warrior 1, because the external rotation of that back hip and trying to square it down may go against the anatomy of your hips, depending on how your bones are structured. And also that extreme flexion of the back ankle can be really inaccessible for people that have larger talus bone. The next pose I want to talk about is Goddess. This is one that I will sequence on occasion. So this isn't one that I never sequence, but it is one that I am careful about sequencing and careful about how I cue it, because I feel as though some of the cueing that I hear for Goddess pose can be a little bit outdated. There are certain poses that I don't think there's anything wrong with them, but the way that they were formerly cued by the majority of teachers was just a little bit off in translation. So for example, in a goddess pose, you're with both knees in external rotations pointed out to the side, toes pointed out to the side, and then you bend into both knees. A cue that I often heard when I was first starting out in my yoga practice was pretend you're in a toaster or pretend you're between two panes of glass when you're in a goddess pose. So that's really taking it into the idea that we're aiming for 180 degrees of external rotation of the knees, and we're also attempting to have a torso that is entirely upright. So when I'm cueing goddess, I always encourage people to take their toes to point out where it feels natural, so that when they bend their knees, the knees are able to track directly over the toes. And if the knees are pointing slightly forward, that's okay. If the torso needs to take a slight lean forward to make the space in the hip feel a little bit more comfortable, then you would take the torso slightly forward. So I often do like to cue that you can have the hands on the thighs for a little bit of additional support if you want to lean that torso forward. Because you can teach goddess pose in a way that's a little bit more active, and I think that it is good to work that external rotation and strengthen into the glutes and pull the knees outwards to the side and do that using the strength of your glutes. I do think that's important to work. However, cueing it as though you should be in a toaster and the knees should be pointed directly to the side is really going to be largely inaccessible for a lot of practitioners. So this discussion about goddess leads me into the next pose that I actually never teach this one. If people want to take it in my class, that's their own prerogative. I'm not going to stop somebody if they enjoy this pose, but I will never actually call it out. This pose was largely why I became injured in the first place. So this pose is frog pose, which is basically like goddess pose, but laying on your belly. So you're on your belly, knees outwards to the sides, and your inner knees are on the floor. The whole inner side of your leg is ideally on the floor, and then you try to get your hips to come down to the floor as well. So both knees, again, extreme external rotation. The reason that I don't like this one, as you can probably guess, is because if you have hip anatomy that does not allow for that extreme external rotation, this pose is going to be really just hard on your knees and also hard on your hips. And because you have gravity pushing down on you as well, it's going to add some extra strain to this pose that you would not get doing it as a standing goddess pose. Because when you do it standing, at the very least, you're just able to pull the knees out as far as you can go. Whereas when you're on your belly in your frog, the gravity is going to be pulling down on you and potentially will take you a little bit further than you want to go. The other thing that I used to do was I would stay in frog pose and I would have my mom press down on my hips or my teacher press down on my hips or my feet to try and get them to come closer to the floor. So that is definitely something I don't recommend. This is something that is a common practice among dancers. So a lot of my experience in the dance world as well was that forcing down and adding to the strain that I was putting on my joints. I don't really think that there's ever a need for frog pose when you can do half frog. So half frog would be the same pose, but you just take one of your legs to parallel and extend it down the length of your mat, and then you would take the other knee to bend and come out where it's into that external rotation. So with this, it's a lot easier on the joint because you can allow one hip to do the external rotation and the other hip can be parallel or even a little bit internally rotated to make more space so you can really just focus on the one side. And for practitioners who can be in a frog and be relatively comfortable, I would argue that you're probably already flexible enough in the hips that you don't really need that particular pose to try and get more flexible. Because if you're sitting in it and you don't really feel any sensation, then there's probably other poses that you could work on that would benefit you more. Again, that was the particular pose that caused me to have an injury, so I do have a bit of a personal bias against it, and that is largely why I feel that it is unsafe and why I don't teach it. But there's a lot of people I know that love frog pose and they say it feels great for them. So if that is you, all I would say is just try to be careful and just really always be observant of your body and always listening to what your body is trying to tell you. All right, next pose that I don't teach, you can probably guess it has something to do with the hips. And so this one is lotus pose. Lotus is not a pose that I have in my practice at all. So that is part of the reason why I choose not to teach it. This one I don't feel quite as strongly about as I do about frog pose, for example, because the angle at which your femur is coming into the hip socket is slightly different because you have your legs out in front of you, in front of the torso, rather than directly to the side, because you're sitting up in a lotus pose, so it is a little bit of a different angle. However, I do feel as though if you don't have a lot of mobility in the hips, and if you do have issues with the skeletal structure of your hips allowing you to come into extreme external rotation, then a lot of lotus ends up coming into your knees and also into your ankles. So you may notice that people that maybe don't have a ton of hip flexibility, but they're able to get into lotus, that their knees look like they're kind of twerking and maybe they have a bit of a sickle in the ankle. So these are compensations that happen within the body if your hips aren't open enough to come into a full lotus, which is basically like a cross-legged seat with your legs folded into one another. And you may see people do this pose in inversions as well. So their legs are in the orientation of lotus while they're either standing on their head or in handstand or forearm stand. So I do think that there are benefits to lotus pose. I think it's a really fun one. It's definitely one that feels really good when you accomplish it. But I generally don't like to teach poses that I am not able to access myself, because I feel like if I can't experience it in my own body, I would definitely have a bit of trouble translating it to someone else in a helpful or intelligent manner. So that's largely why I don't teach lotus, because it's not a pose that I will probably ever be able to attain myself. So I don't really feel that it would be right for me to try and convey the best way to get into that pose to someone else. So there's lots of teachers that are able to teach lotus and would do a much better job teaching it, so I'm going to leave that to those teachers to teach that particular pose. And for the last one, this one is another one that it's not that I would never teach it, but it would be pretty rare that I would sequence this in. And again, if I was going to sequence this into my classes, I would be pretty mindful about how I was cueing, and I would probably do a little bit of workshopping with this before having students do it in a sequence. And this would be any pose where you're coming into a twist and latching the elbow towards the outer knee to come into the twist. So the reason that I don't love this is because I feel like you can get a lot more benefit out of coming into twists using the strength of your core exclusively. So for example, if I had someone in a lunge and I had their hands to heart center, I would have them twist without using momentum, without using any leverage of the elbow to the outer side of the thigh, before I would have them place their elbow to the outer edge of their thigh. Because what I see a lot is when people are, say you're in your lunge with your hands to heart center, and the teacher will cue you to twist and latch your elbow to the outer edge of the knee. I see people kind of toss their torso and jerk into the twist very quickly in hopes that they will move past where their leg is and on the way back hopefully catch the elbow on the outside of the knee. So I see this kind of jerk and catch a lot. Even with practitioners that have been going for a long time, I will see them fall into this trap of just trying to get the elbow to the outer edge of the leg in any way that they can. Ideally, what we want to do is use the strength of the core to begin the twist And then if it's accessible to reach the elbow to the outer edge of the leg, moving into it slowly and mindfully, then we can use that twist to expand a little bit more. But we never want to be jerking our body into any pose really, but especially not jerking the spine around in different directions. So a lot of times what I will try to teach instead of latching the elbow to the outer edge of the thigh is maybe I would have the arms extended forward and just twist the torso with the arms staying extended forward, or maybe coming into a high lunge with the twist open with the arms to a T, maybe take that into exalted warrior, taking it up and back and moving through different ranges and different planes of the twist. So that is ideally what I try to gravitate towards instead. Occasionally I will cue the elbow to the outer edge of the thigh. That is going to be really helpful if you're cueing into things like side crow or offering twisted arm balances, kind of a transition from those twisted lunges and the twisted chairs and everything like that. So there is a time and a place for it, but I just think you have to be really diligent about how you're cueing so that your students aren't tempted to just get into that twist by any means necessary, even if it means compromising the health of their spine. So those are the 5 poses that I generally don't teach or avoid altogether. If you have any opinions of your own about poses that you're not a big fan of, that you generally avoid, or maybe if a teacher offers them, you choose to sub something else out, please let me know in the comments. I'm always curious to hear things that work for certain people and maybe things that don't work in other people's bodies, things that maybe I haven't considered before. Maybe there's transitions that you don't really love or feel odd in your body and you try to avoid them for that reason. I'm always curious to know what people think about different transitions and how it feels to different bodies, because I only have this body and this experience, and I can reference my students' experience, but really, unless you have these discussions, we don't learn about how other people feel in the poses and what is most beneficial to the most amount of people and what is going to be really accessible for teaching things like all levels classes. So please do have a discourse in the comments about poses that you enjoy and poses that you don't. And if you disagree with any of the things that I laid out, please do leave your opinion in the comments as well. I would love to hear different perspectives, and if there's information that I'm not privy to, I definitely want to be aware of it and I want to learn more. So I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I'm hoping to do a couple more commentary videos like this. So if you have any suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, please let me know. I would love some ideas and inspiration, and I'll see you in the next one.